Well, hello, friends, and welcome back to Saints, Sinners, and Apostles, finding our faith, finding our faith family. I'm Dr. Jim Berger. We are at Chapel by the Sea on Fort Myers Beach. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for those of you who are present with me today, this audience I have. We are looking at the foundation of our faith. This is our spiritual DNA. And we're taking 12 weeks to look at all this. So we began last week, 2 weeks ago. We're heading go right up just before Thanksgiving, we'll wrap up. And today we're going to meet 5 more of the saints. And these are the people who helped Jesus in some way. We're going to meet the family from Bethany, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And we're going to meet 2 members of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. All these people have minor roles to play, but each one of them is critical to the story of Jesus's life. So let's start with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They're sisters and brother. As I said, they live in Bethany, and they appear to be well off because they have their own house. And the house is large enough to accommodate guests, which is significant. While I was in the Bahamas, I once took several days to tour Cat Island, which is south of Nassau. And at one point, I guess up until about the 50s, there was 8,000 or 10,000 people living on the island. Today, there's probably less than 1,000. And there's a lot of little coral stone houses abandoned all over the island. So I stopped and I went into one of them just to look around. And they're all the same. There's just a single room, about 10 feet long by about 8 feet or 10 feet wide. And that's it. That's the whole house. And what I realized was you live around the house, but you don't live in the house. We think of living in our houses, but their life was very much outside, all around, and very communal also. That was the other characteristic of the area. And so now they're all abandoned, but you wouldn't be able to have a dinner for 8 or 10 in that little house. You'd have to hold it outside. Their house was large enough that they could hold a dinner party with Jesus and his entourage. And on several occasions, we're told, they host Jesus. So there was a standing relationship between this family and Jesus. Whether they're related, we have no idea, but there was obviously some kind of deep friendship. There's no occupation mentioned for them. Yet Mary can afford this jar of expensive perfume known as nard, which we'll hear about in a few minutes. So obviously they're well off, and they're close friends of Jesus. At one point, Martha refers to her brother as says to Jesus, Lazarus, whom you love. So there's a close tie between them. In Luke 10, there's a dinner for Jesus at their home, and Martha is the hostess. She's doing all the serving. She's the finisher. She's the hard worker, dependable, determined. But she's also a woman of deep faith, which we're going to see in a few moments. We typically remember Martha as being the one who was the worker, who did all the serving and such, and the cooking. But we're also going to see she has a very profound faith, deeper than most of the apostles. So we'll pick that up in a moment. She has a depth in her spirituality. She's a sister to Mary and Lazarus, a friend of Jesus, and a beloved daughter of God. And Martha, as the eldest, is the doer. She's serving this meal that we hear about in chapter 10 of Luke. Mary, on the other hand, she's more the thinker. And so she's sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to his teaching, as are the other disciples. She's more the thinker. She listens. She's being a disciple. And she's breaking the rule. Only men were allowed to be disciples. The Pharisees had a saying, better that you give God's word to the dog than teach it to your daughters. And and among I think it's 13 benedictions, there's one that says, I thank thee, O God, that thou hast not made me a Gentile, a dog, or a woman. So she's breaking all the norms by sitting with the men and learning and listening. But Jesus ignores those traditions. He encourages her to think, to learn, and to step forward as a leader. Now, Martha's role is important also, but women are not welcome at that point to learn about God. John 11, we find the story of the death and resurrection of Lazarus. When he fell ill, the sisters sent word to Jesus asking him to come to their brother's aid. And although he's ill, Jesus tarries and he delays for 2 days. And during that time, Lazarus dies. And the family is heartbroken. They're in mourning. And when a family is in mourning, number one, they stay home for 7 days, sitting barefoot. Number two, they don't wash themselves or their clothes, and they do no work. So it's much like a Sabbath. They don't cook. Friends and family members come in and bring them food. Now, the deceased must be entombed within 24 hours of dying. And when they entomb them, they wrap the body like we're used to seeing mummies wrapped. That's how the traditional burial. On the third day, the tomb was opened again and the body was inspected to be sure the party was dead. Now, to us, that sounds rather odd, but at that time, it was possible that somebody would be buried alive, entombed alive. And so we have vestiges of that in our language, in our culture. One is sometimes they would tie a string to the person's hand when they put him in the tomb, and that string went up to a bell up above. And so somebody was supposed to sit by that grave for 3 days and watch. And if the person revived, they would be a dead ringer. They'd ring the bell. Other traditions, they had a string tied to the foot and went up to a bucket. And if they woke up and twitched, they'd kick the bucket. And that's where these terms come from. I had an elder in the Bahamas whose relatives were from Scotland. He was a Scottish descendant. And there was a story in their family that there was a preacher, this would be like in the late 1800s, and his wife died. And they put her in the coffin and took her to be buried. And they buried her with this beautiful ring on her finger. And the family gathered around, they had the graveside service, and everybody went home before they filled in the hole. And the grave digger had seen that ring. And so he went back to fill in the hole. But first he jumped down in and was going to get that ring off her finger, and he tried to cut it off. And when he did, she woke up and scared the bejeebers out of the grave digger. She scrambled out of the hole and made her way back to the house and knocked on the door. And the family maid came to the door. And when she opened it up and looked and saw the dead woman standing there, she fainted. And the woman's pounding on the door, let me in, let me in. I think it was raining, cold. It's Scotland, of course it's cold and raining. And finally they came to the door and found her, and everybody was astounded. And they brought her in, warmed her up, and she lived to a ripe old age. And that ring was passed down in the family. And he said, last I heard, it was one of my relatives who'd moved to Australia who has that ring now. But that was an actual case where somebody had revived when they thought sure she was dead. So this whole point of going to third day and opening the tomb is really important for the families. But Jesus arrives on the fourth day, and it's obvious Lazarus is dead because now they can smell the decomposition. They can smell the body. And as he arrives with his apostles, Martha goes out to meet him on the road, and she scolds him. You don't think of anybody yelling at Jesus, do you? She says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And he tells her that her brother will rise again. And she says, I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus replies, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me shall not die, but shall have everlasting life. She says, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God. The disciples have not said this yet, but Martha says it. Her witness places her on an equal level, equal footing with the disciples. This is a woman of deep, profound faith. And what we think about is, oh, she's the one who waited on the tables. Oh, she's the one, the first one that declares Jesus is the Messiah. Mary comes out along with the mourners, and she shows him the tomb. And as they go up, Jesus is overwhelmed. This guy's human. This is his friend, the guy he loved. And so we're told that overcome with grief, Jesus weeps for his friend. But Jesus prays, then he summons Lazarus. Lazarus, come forth. And to everyone's amazement, they've rolled back the stone. To everyone's amazement, out he comes. And many of those present at that point believed in Jesus. Now, also present are a number of Pharisees and other leaders we're not far from Jerusalem at Bethany. So there's other people present. And because of this, opposition to Jesus grew among the powerful because people were following him. There was even a plot to kill Lazarus. But Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are the three that are so important. In John 12, they hold a dinner for Jesus and his friends, and it's a Sunday evening. And the following Friday, this is Sunday night, the following Friday, Jesus will be executed. He'll be dead on the cross. So the house at Bethany was a safe place for him. And it was common for men and women to dine together in that culture. So Lazarus is at table with Jesus, Martha serving, and in a foreshadowing of the Eucharist meal, they're breaking bread together. The following Sunday evening, he will break bread with the disciples in Emmaus, and then go back to the upper room and have more food with the apostles in the upper room. Martha's role is being the deacon, the one who serves and gives the Eucharist. Mary enters with a pound of pure nard, a very costly perfume. And she uses it to anoint Jesus's feet and to wipe them with her hair. This is unprecedented because in that culture, women never let their hair down in public. They always kept it covered and bound up. So for her to, in presence of everybody, uncover her head, let down her hair, and use it to wipe his feet is an act of extreme devotion and extreme boldness. She anoints him as king and Messiah, and that's a declaration of faith on her part. Her sister has said, I believe you are the Messiah. Mary demonstrates it by her actions. And these stories of the sisters point to the major role for women in the church. And what it tells us is these offices are for saints, regardless of gender, regardless of nationality, because the saints we're going to meet are not all Jews. Many of them are Romans and Greeks. But they testify that Jesus was the Messiah, and he affirmed their witness. Now, Lazarus has more of a passive role. He's Jesus' beloved friend, and there's little testimony as to what else he did. He believed in Jesus. He obeyed when Jesus called. And we know that he continues as a leader of the church, a saint in the Jerusalem church. So after that dinner, 6 days later, Jesus is hanging on a cross dead. And seemingly out of nowhere, a guy named Joseph of Arimathea appears, and he asks Pilate for Jesus's body. Who is this guy? Well, he's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's a very high counselor among the Jewish people. The Sanhedrin had 70 members, and he's one of them. He's a secret disciple of Jesus. And yet he went boldly before Pilate to request Jesus's body. And he drafts his friend Nicodemus, who we met in John 3 when he came to Jesus by night. We'll talk about Nicodemus in a moment. But he and Nicodemus take the body, and he lays his Lord's body in his own tomb. So this whole question about what if the women had gone to the wrong tomb, there's no doubt about which was the right tomb. Joseph owns it. He can go back there and show you where it should be. He's a man of wealth and estate, a man of power and prestige, and he's a saint. So he and Nicodemus are the ones who bring the body to be prepared for burial and then take it to the tomb. He's mentioned in all four Gospels and only in this context, and he's assisted by Nicodemus. And we first meet Nicodemus way back in John chapter 3 when he comes to Jesus by night and asks him, what is this you're teaching? And Jesus is telling him he must be born again. Now, he's a Pharisee. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's considered a master in Israel. He's wealthy, he's learned, and he's curious. He seeks Jesus to learn more. And Jesus explains that one must be born again to enter the kingdom of heaven. He's confused by that, but Jesus famously says, tells him that for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but that through him the world might be saved. So we're not told what happened after that conversation. But in John 7, there's a debate in the Sanhedrin about this new prophet, this new teacher coming from Galilee. And there's a debate about what to do with him. And he reminds them that an innocent man cannot be condemned without the chance to speak. But the rest of the council ridicules him because they say no prophet comes from Galilee. There's geographic discrimination at that time too. Well, in John 19, he appears again, and he's assisting Joseph in embalming Jesus and entombing him. So they go to the market. They have to move fast to do all this because Jesus dies. He's on at 3 o'clock. They're taking him down off the cross. And so he's got to be in the tomb before dark. So they have to move really fast. They get to the market. They buy a mixture of myrrh and aloes. They buy 70 pounds. Think about that. 70 pounds of myrrh and aloes. They spent a lot of money on this. And he's a wealthy man, but the quantity of the balm tells us he's treating this as a royal burial. And what happens is as they wrap him, they layer the spices in with it to embalm the body, to preserve it, and to kill that stench from it. So they prepare his body for burial. They take it, they put it in his tomb, in Joseph's tomb, have the servants roll that giant stone in front of it. And when the stone rolls in front, it drops down into a little dip so that it won't rock out. And so in order to move it, it takes several strong men to push it back up the incline and chock it in place. So they are the ones who are responsible for preserving his body and protecting it. And there's just two more saints in our story, but they play a significant role in our faith development. The DNA of our faith runs through men like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, through Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. These are just 5 saints who appear briefly, who play their important role and live out their faith and their life quietly. But what they did in those moments was critical to our faith story and the story of all those since then coming down to us. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, the 3 from Bethany, Nicodemus, and Joseph of Arimathea, 2 men of prestige and power who risked everything to serve their Lord in the proper moment. So next week, we're going to look at some more people. We're going to look at Stephen and the other deacons. There's 7 deacons altogether. We're going to look at Ananias and Cornelius. And what's significant about Cornelius is he's not Jewish, but he's a saint. All right. I'm Dr. Jim Berger. This is Saints, Sinners, and Apostles, Finding Our Faith Family. So thank you for joining me, and tune in again as we continue with our story, as we look at our ancestors in the faith and find out more about our genealogy in Christ. All right. Questions or comments?
Was there also a financial impact on the sisters with Lazarus's death?
Was there a financial impact with Lazarus' death? I suspect there was. Yeah. I'm sure that would have been a dire situation for them. We don't know who the rest of the family is, but obviously there's more family around because they're all taking care of them after Lazarus' death. But nonetheless, yes, there would have been a severe impact on them. Penury, probably.
You know, it's interesting with Mary and Martha. You know the different stories. And I always thought it was separate stories. I didn't think it was the same people. I don't know. I just when you trace that through, that's fascinating.
Yes.
I remember her in the kitchen and the other things, and I had no idea. Obviously, they're the same person.
Yeah, and
I mean, they keep reappearing.
Yeah, and it's interesting how many times they appear in the story,
Yeah.
but we're not thinking in terms of
Following it through.
following
That's
it through,
crazy. Yeah,
right? We're looking at it as isolated
Yeah.
text we're
I
reading,
found that
but it's
fascinating.
an ongoing story
Right,
over
that's
3
why I
years.
can read those references.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I kind of missed that. Interesting.
All right, well, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here with us. And I'm Dr. Jim Berger, your interim pastor, and we'll continue this next time with Saints, Sinners, and Apostles.
When my wife and I went to Israel